May 1st, 1982, the South Atlantic Ocean. The sky is a bruised purple, stretching endlessly over the freezing grey waters of the Falkland Sound. Inside the cockpit of a French-built Mirage 3 interceptor, the air is thin and smells of recycled oxygen and nervous sweat. The pilot, a lieutenant in the Argentine Air Force, checks his instrument panel. His heart rate is climbing, syncing with the rhythmic thrum of the ATAR 9C engine screaming behind him. He is hunting. On his radar, a blip appears. It is slow. Lethargic, almost. Intel suggests it is a British Sea Harrier. The Argentine pilot tightens his grip on the stick. In the briefing rooms back at the Rio Grande Air Base, the commanders had been confident. They laughed at the Harrier. They called it a toy. It was a jump jet, a subsonic curiosity designed for air shows and vertical takeoffs, not for the brutal, high-energy mathematics of a dogfight. Against the supersonic delta-wing Mirage aircraft capable of Mark II, the Harrier should be nothing more than a sitting duck. The lieutenant pushes his throttle forward. The Mirage accelerates, tearing through the sound barrier's edge. He has the energy advantage. He has the altitude. He dives, lining up the clunky silhouette of the British jet in his sights. The engagement geometry is perfect. He is coming in fast from the rear quarter, the classic killing zone of aerial warfare. He waits for the tone of his heat-seeking missile. The British pilot is unaware. He has to be. No one flies that straight when a predator is closing in at 700 knots. Then, the impossible happens. Physics, as the Argentine pilot understands it, ceases to apply. The British jet does not bank hard to the left or right to evade. It does not dive. It does not climb. It simply stops. In the blink of an eye, the Harrier decelerates as if it has hit an invisible brick wall in the middle of the sky. The Argentine pilot gasps, his brain struggling to process the visual data. His Mirage is traveling at nearly supersonic speed. He expects the target to remain in front of him, but the target is suddenly effectively stationary. The Mirage screams past the British jet in a blur of grey metal. The hunter has instantly become the prey. The Argentine pilot frantically yanks the stick back, trying to bleed off speed, trying to turn his heavy delta-wing fighter around, but it is too late. The geometry is flipped. The toy is now directly behind him. The last thing the lieutenant hears is the terrifying, high-pitched growl of a Sidewinder missile locking onto his exhaust plume. Static fills the radio channels. Back at the command center on the mainland, the silence is deafening. They stare at the radar screens. 1 minute their interceptors were on the offensive, closing in for easy kills. The next, the blips vanished. Reports start trickling in from the surviving wingmen, voices cracking with panic and disbelief. They are not talking about British radar jamming or new surface-to-air missiles. They are talking about ghosts. They are reporting that the British planes are defying the laws of aerodynamics. "It didn't turn, sir," one pilot stammers over the encrypted channel, his voice trembling. "It stopped. I swear on my life, the machine just stopped in mid-air." The Argentine commanders exchange worried glances. They are fighting a war for the Falkland Islands, a territory they claim as the Malvinas. They are using proven French technology and American A-4 Skyhawk aircraft. They know how planes fly. Planes rely on lift and thrust. If you stop moving forward at 20,000 feet, you stall, you fall, you die. But the British aren't falling. They are killing. If you enjoy unraveling the hidden mechanics of history's deadliest conflicts, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We investigate the technology and tactics that defined the 20th century. Now, let's return to the mystery in the South Atlantic. By the evening of May 1st, the mood in the Argentine officers' mess has shifted from nationalistic fervor to cold dread. The pilots huddled around tables are not rookies. These are men trained in French and American combat doctrines. They know the capabilities of the MiG-21 aircraft flown by the Soviets. They know the speed of the F-4 Phantom aircraft. They understand the chessboard of the sky. But they cannot understand what they saw today. A senior officer lays a map of the islands on the table, weighing down the corners with heavy brass casings. He looks at his men. "We need to understand what happened up there," he says, his voice low. "We lost 2 Mirage aircraft and a Canberra today. The British Sea Harriers are slow, they are heavy, they should not be able to outmaneuver a supersonic interceptor." One of the survivors of the morning skirmish leans forward, his hands still shaking slightly. "It wasn't a maneuver, Colonel. It was a magic trick. I was on his tail. I had tone. And then he floated. He lifted his nose, and the plane just hung there. I overshot him by half a mile before I could blink. The room falls silent. The colonel lights a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the dim lights. The implications are terrifying. If the British have a weapon or a technique that allows them to negate the advantage of speed, the entire Argentine strategy is flawed. Their plan relies on hit-and-run tactics, coming in low and fast, dropping bombs on the British fleet, and escaping before the enemy can react. But if the enemy can manipulate time and space in a dogfight, there is no escape. The intelligence officers begin scrambling for answers. They pull manuals on the Harrier jet, specifically the jump jet capabilities. They know it can take off vertically from a carrier deck. That is a known fact. It uses thrust vectoring to lift off the ground, but the manuals say this is a takeoff and landing procedure. It is strictly forbidden in forward flight. The stress on the airframe would be catastrophic. The engine would choke. The pilot would lose control. They are doing something else, the colonel mutters, staring at the map. The Americans, are they involved? Is this a new system? A new computer? Rumors begin to circulate through the barracks. Some say the Americans have supplied the British with a classified radar jamming system that creates hallucinations on the HUD. Others whisper that the Harrier pilots are drugged, suicidal maniacs pushing their machines beyond the breaking point. But the reality is far more concerning than rumors. The Argentine Air Force is facing a technological anomaly. They are flying 1960s and 70s era jets against a machine that seems to operate in a different dimension of physics. As the sun sets over the freezing Atlantic, the Argentine pilots realize something chilling. They are not just fighting the British task force. They are fighting a mystery. And until they solve it, every time they climb into a cockpit, they are flying into a trap. The sky has turned against them. Mid-May, 1982. The waters of San Carlos. The conflict has evolved from skirmishes into a full-scale meat grinder. The British task force has entered the Sound, and the Argentine Air Force has launched everything they have to stop the landing. The sky above the islands is now the most dangerous airspace on Earth. For the Argentine pilots flying the A-4 Skyhawk aircraft and the Israeli-built Dagger aircraft, the mission is suicidal but necessary. They must fly incredibly low, sometimes 20 feet above the waves, to avoid the lethal Sea Dart missiles of the Royal Navy destroyers. Salt spray literally coats their windshields. They are flying on pure adrenaline and reflex. But the real terror isn't the missiles from the ships. It is the dark shapes patrolling the clouds above. The Sea Harriers. Captain Roberto, a veteran Dagger pilot, leads a flight of 3 into Bomb Alley. His breathing is ragged. The intelligence briefings have become exercises in frustration. The command staff still cannot explain the events of May 1st. They have analyzed the gun camera footage from the few planes that returned. They have run the numbers. The math doesn't add up. Keep your speed up, Roberto warns his wingmen. Do not turn with them. If you see a Harrier, extend and run. Do not engage. It goes against every instinct of a fighter pilot. The Dagger is a Mark II aircraft. It is a sleek, delta-winged Predator designed to hunt bombers and fight other supersonic jets. The Harrier is a subsonic, distinctively ugly aircraft that looks more like a flying insect than a fighter. Running away from it feels cowardly. It feels wrong. But Roberto knows better. He has seen the empty bunks in the barracks. Suddenly, the radio crackles. "Bandits! 6 o'clock! They're diving on us!" Roberto cranes his neck. 2 Harriers are dropping out of the sun, their cannons flashing. The ambush is textbook. The Daggers jettison their drop tanks to shed weight and brake hard to the right. The engagement turns into a swirling, chaotic furball. Roberto spots a Harrier isolating his wingman. The British jet is closing in. Roberto reacts instantly. He pulls his Dagger into a tight loop, intending to cut across the circle and rake the Harrier with cannon fire. He has the angle. He has the speed. He is coming in fast, expecting the Harrier to bank horizontally to avoid the shot. But the Harrier does not bank. For the second time in the war, the laws of physics seem to glitch. As Roberto lines up his sights, the British jet suddenly jolts upwards. Not in a smooth climb, but a violent, vertical translation. It is as if a giant hand has grabbed the fuselage and yanked it 50 feet straight up, while the plane is still traveling forward at 400 knots. Roberto's stream of cannon shells passes harmlessly through the empty air where the Harrier was a fraction of a second ago. "Impossible," he whispers. The sudden vertical jump has forced the Harrier to bleed speed rapidly, causing Roberto to overshoot. He flies right underneath the British jet. As he looks up through his canopy, he sees something that chills his blood. Smoke is blasting out of the sides of the Harrier. Usually, jet exhaust comes out the back. It pushes the plane forward, but Roberto sees thick, dark exhaust plumes erupting from nozzles under the wing roots, pointing down and forward. The Harrier isn't just flying, it is clawing at the air itself. Before Roberto can recover from his shock, the Harrier noses over. It is now above and behind him. The hunter has become the hunted in the span of 3 seconds. The warning receiver in Roberto's cockpit screams a missile lock. He brakes hard, diving for the deck, pulling so many Gs his vision greys out. He barely escapes, the white trail of a sidewinder missing his tail by yards. Back at the Rio Grande Air Base, the debriefing is chaotic. The pilots are angry. They are slamming their helmets on the tables. "It jumped," one pilot yells, using his hands to mimic the motion. "I was on his 6. I had him dead to rights. And then he just hopped over me. A fixed-wing aircraft cannot do that." The intelligence officers are baffled. They know the Harrier has rotating nozzles for vertical landing. They are called the Pegasus engine's cold and hot nozzles. But every manual, every technical report from the Soviets and the French states that these nozzles are for hovering. If you rotate them in forward flight, the airflow should rip the wings off. The engine should suffer a compressor stall. The plane should tumble out of the sky. A Soviet observer, attached unofficially to the intelligence unit to monitor NATO capabilities, listens intently. He is writing furiously in a notebook. The Soviet Union has its own VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing, aircraft, the Yak-38. But the Yak-38 is a clumsy beast. It can barely lift its own weight, let alone fight. The pilots hate it. It cannot vector thrust in a dogfight. The Soviets had assumed the British Harrier was similar, a gimmick, a naval curiosity. But the reports from the Falklands are painting a different picture. The British are achieving a kill ratio that defies logic. They are shooting down Mark II interceptors with subsonic jets. They are winning turn fights they should lose. They are escaping locks that should be lethal. The mystery deepens when a blurry photograph, taken by an Argentine ground observer, is developed. It shows a Sea Harrier in combat. The image is grainy, but one detail stands out. The exhaust plumes are not streaming straight back. They are angled down. Are they breaking their own planes? An Argentine engineer asks, staring at the photo under a magnifying glass. Are they forcing the nozzles down to create drag? It's madness. The structural stress. The pilots don't care about structural stress. They care about survival. A psychological rot begins to set in. They start calling the Harrier the Black Death. They feel like they are fighting a sorcerer, not a soldier. The core of the mystery is this. How can a pilot control a plane that is effectively crashing upwards? In a standard jet, if you lose speed, you lose control surfaces, your ailerons and elevators become mushy. You can't steer. But the British pilots seem to retain perfect control even when they are hanging in the air at 0 airspeed. They are missing a piece of the puzzle. They are looking at the Harrier as a plane. They are judging it by the rules of aerodynamics they learned in flight school. They don't realize that the British aren't flying by aerodynamics alone. They are flying on pillars of raw power. As May bleeds into June, the Argentine Air Force is being bled dry. They have lost dozens of Mirage and Skyhawk aircraft. The pilots are exhausted. They are brave men, arguably some of the most skilled aviators in the world to fly in such conditions, but bravery cannot calculate the impossible. Every time they engage, they wait for the Harrier dance. They wait for that terrifying moment when the enemy jet defies inertia, and they know that once the dance begins, they are already dead. The command needs an answer. They need to know if this is a secret weapon, a new engine, or a tactic they can counter. Because if they don't figure it out soon, there will be no Air Force left to defend the islands. Early June 1982, a discreet safe house in Buenos Aires. While the pilots died in the freezing skies over the Falklands, a different kind of war was being fought in a smoke-filled room in the capital. A Soviet naval attaché, technically a diplomat, but in reality a GRU intelligence officer, was staring at a stack of classified reports provided by his Argentine counterparts. The Soviets were terrified. For decades, Soviet aerial doctrine had been built on speed and energy. The MiG-21 aircraft, the MiG-23 aircraft, and the terrifying MiG-25 Foxbat aircraft, they were all designed to go fast, shoot, and leave. They were arrows. They believed that in the missile age, maneuverability was dead. If you were slow, you were dead. But the reports on the table described a ghost that killed arrows. The Russian officer picked up a transcript of a pilot debriefing. The pilot described a Harrier engaging in a scissors maneuver, a classic defensive move where two planes weave back and forth to force the other to overshoot. Usually, the plane with the lower wing loading wins. But the Harrier had done something that defied aerodynamic logic. At the apex of the turn, when the Harrier should have been struggling for lift, its nose didn't just drift across the horizon, it snapped. The transcript read, "The target pivoted. It didn't bank and pull. It just rotated on its center axis like a tank turret. It turned a corner in the sky. It made a square turn." The Russian dropped the paper. A square turn. Fixed-wing aircraft turn in arcs. The radius of the turn is dictated by speed and g-force. To turn 90 degrees instantly is physically impossible for a conventional airframe. It would require the plane to completely decouple its heading from its velocity vector. If the British had mastered this, every Soviet fighter jet currently in production was obsolete. Back in the theater of operations, the Argentine pilots were beginning to suspect the truth, but knowing it didn't save them. They were trapped in a psychological cage. They knew that if they got into a knife fight in a phone booth, a close-range dogfight, the Harrier possessed an invisible advantage. Major Carlos, a squadron leader for the Mirage unit, decided to test a dangerous theory. He believed the magic had a limit. It had to be tied to the engine. If the Harrier was using its engine to hold itself up, it must be burning fuel at a catastrophic rate. It must be generating massive heat. His plan was to force the Harrier high, up where the air was thin, up where the Harrier's non-afterburning engine would gasp for air, and the delta-wing Mirage would reign supreme. On June 8th, Carlos got his chance. He spotted a lone Sea Harrier patrolling at 20,000 feet. This was high for them. Usually they hugged the waves. Carlos signaled his wingman to stay low and climbed rapidly, engaging his afterburner. The Mirage screamed upward, piercing the cloud layer, a silver dart against the dark blue zenith. He dove on the Harrier from above. The British pilot broke hard, turning into the attack. Carlos grinned behind his oxygen mask. "Good," he thought. "Turn. Bleed your energy." The two jets entered a spiraling descent. The Mirage was faster, but the Harrier was tighter. Carlos kept the pressure on, refusing to let the British pilot disengage. He watched his airspeed indicator. They were getting slow. 300 knots. 250 knots. This was the danger zone for a delta-wing jet. Without speed, the Mirage became a falling brick. But for the Harrier, Carlos expected the same. He waited for the British wings to wobble, for the nose to drop, indicating a stall. Once the Harrier stalled, Carlos would use his superior engine power to loop over and kill it. 200 knots. The wind noise dropped to a whisper. "Stall, damn you," Carlos hissed, but the Harrier didn't stall. Instead, the British aircraft did the unthinkable. With barely any forward airspeed, the nose of the Harrier suddenly pitched up violently, pointing almost 90 degrees straight up at the Sunday. It hung there, suspended on a pillar of invisible fire. Carlos's eyes widened. The Harrier wasn't flying on its wings anymore. It was balancing on its thrust. The Mirage, unable to match this impossible angle of attack at such low speed, slid helplessly past the Harrier. Carlos had fallen into the trap. He had tried to force an energy fight, but he had forgotten that his opponent could generate lift without speed. As the Mirage drifted past, the Harrier simply pivoted its nose down. It was a movement of mechanical precision, not aerodynamic flow. The British pilot was now looking down into Carlos's cockpit from a distance of less than 300 meters. The square turn wasn't just a turn. It was a complete decoupling of where the plane was going and where the plane was pointing. The Harrier was still traveling horizontally, but its nose and its guns were pointing wherever the pilot wanted. Carlos slammed his throttle forward, desperate for the raw power of his afterburner to save him. The Atar engine roared, kicking him in the back. He dove, twisting, praying for speed. "Missile launch!" his wingman screamed over the radio. Carlos looked back. A Sidewinder AIM-9L was snake-charming its way toward him. But it wasn't just the missile that terrified him. It was the sight of the Harrier. It was still hanging there. It hadn't stalled. It hadn't spun out. It had simply rotated, fired, and was now casually resuming flight. The The missile clipped the Mirage's tail. The explosion shredded the rudder. Carlos ejected seconds before his machine disintegrated into a fireball over the chopped waters of the Atlantic. Floating down under his parachute, watching the burning wreckage of his supersonic fighter hit the water, Carlos finally understood the twist. They weren't fighting a plane. They were fighting a helicopter disguised as a jet. The British weren't just using the nozzles for takeoff and landing. They were using them in combat. They were vectoring thrust in forward flight to change the shape of the battle. The Soviet observer's fear was confirmed. The British had unlocked a new dimension of aerial warfare. They had taken the X and Y axis of a dogfight and added a Z axis that only they could control. But there was one final terrifying piece of the puzzle. The maneuver was incredibly risky. The manual said it shouldn't be done. The engine manufacturer said it would destroy the turbine blades. So how were the British pilots doing it without falling out of the sky? The answer lay in a small, forbidden lever in the cockpit, and a tactic that would be written into history books not as a maneuver, but as a legend. The secret was not a computer. It was not a hidden thruster. It was not a classified jamming device. The secret was a technique that the British pilots called by a strange, almost comical acronym. VIF. Vectoring in forward flight. To understand why this terrified the Argentine Air Force and baffled the Soviet observers, you have to understand the machine. The Sea Harrier was powered by the Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a turbofan engine with a critical difference. It didn't just shoot exhaust out the back. It channeled the thrust through 4 rotating nozzles, 2 cold nozzles at the front, fed by the bypass air, and 2 hot nozzles at the rear, fed by the jet exhaust. In the cockpit, next to the throttle, was a lever that no other fighter pilot in the world had. It was the nozzle lever. If you pushed it forward, the nozzles pointed aft, and the plane flew like a normal jet. If you pulled it back, the nozzles rotated 98 degrees, pointing straight down and slightly forward, allowing the plane to hover. The manual stated that this system was for takeoff and landing. It was for transitioning from a hover to flight. But the British pilots, trained in the desperate necessity of Cold War survival, asked a question that would change history. What happens if we pull the lever while we are flying at 500 miles per hour? The answer was VIFing, and in 1982, over the Falkland Sound, this technique wasn't just a theory, it was the primary weapon. Let's reconstruct the impossible braking maneuver that haunted the Argentine pilots, breaking it down frame by frame to see the sheer violence of the physics involved. Phase 1. The trap. The British pilot, flying the Sea Harrier, knows he is slower than the French-built Mirage 3 or the Israeli-built Dagger. He cannot outrun them. So, he lures them in. He lets the Argentine pilot get behind him. He lets the enemy radar lock on. He plays the role of the victim. The Argentine pilot, seeing the speed advantage, dives for the kill, pushing his Mach 2 interceptor to the limit. Phase 2. The action. At the critical moment when the enemy is less than a mile behind, the British pilot slams the nozzle lever back. In a fraction of a second, the 4 massive nozzles on the side of the fuselage rotate from 0 degrees, pointing back, to roughly 40 or 50 degrees, pointing down. Phase 3. The physics of stopping. This is where the magic happens. 2 things occur instantly. First, the thrust that was pushing the Harrier forward is suddenly pushing it up. This creates a massive, instantaneous spike in lift. The plane doesn't just climb, it balloons. It pops upward like a cork held underwater and released. Second, and more importantly, the forward thrust is gone. But the plane is shaped like a brick. The air resistance, drag, at 500 knots is immense. Without the engine pushing against it, the Harrier hits an aerodynamic wall. To the enemy pilot behind him, it looks like the Harrier has slammed on the brakes. The rate of closure, the speed at which the 2 planes are moving toward each other explodes. The Argentine jet is doing 600 knots. The Harrier is suddenly effectively doing 300. Phase 4. The overshoot. The Argentine pilot has no time to react. Human reaction time is roughly 0.2 seconds. In that time, his jet has traveled hundreds of feet. He cannot stop. He cannot turn tight enough. He screams past the Harrier, often so close he can see the rivets on the British fuselage. Phase 5. The pivot now. The Harrier pilot pushes the lever forward again. The nozzles rotate back. The engine screams. The British pilot uses the Harrier's incredible low-speed handling to pivot the nose. He is now behind the enemy. The geometry of the fight has flipped 180 degrees in less than 5 seconds. Phase 6. The Fox 2. The British pilot triggers the AIM-9L Sidewinder missile. The shock for the world wasn't just that the plane could do it, it was that the pilots dared to do it. Viffing was violent. When the nozzles rotated at speed, the deceleration force threw the pilot forward into his straps with crushing weight. The airframe groaned under the sudden shift in stress. If the pilot miscalculated, if he pulled the lever too far or too fast, the engine could suffer a compressor stall. The airflow into the intakes would be disrupted, the engine would choke, and the heavy jet would become a falling stone. The British were betting their lives on their engine's stability, and the Pegasus engine held. The Argentine pilots were not baffled because they were incompetent. They were baffled because they were fighting a ghost. They were trained to fight planes that obeyed the laws of momentum. A MiG-21 or an F-4 Phantom cannot stop. It has to curve. The Harrier moved like a UFO. The reports from the surviving Argentine pilots became frantic. "It's the Black Death," they said. "Don't engage the Harrier. It turns on a dime." The psychological impact was devastating. The Argentine Air Force, which had started the war with high morale and superior numbers, began to lose its nerve. They started dropping their bombs early, missing their targets, just to escape the patrol zones of the Sea Harriers. They knew that if a Harrier got behind them, they were dead. But now they knew that if they got behind a Harrier, they were arguably in even more danger. There was no safe angle of attack. But the reveal goes deeper. It wasn't just the British who were watching. The Americans and the Soviets were analyzing every second of this data. For the United States, this was a vindication. The US Marine Corps had adopted the Harrier, the AV-8 Ampères, but had faced skepticism from the traditional Air Force generals, who preferred the fast, sleek F-15 seconds and F-16 seconds. The Falklands proved that in a real, dirty, low-altitude war, speed was not the deciding factor. Agility was. The ability to manipulate the vector of your thrust was more valuable than Mach 2. For the Soviet Union, it was a disaster. Their entire interceptor fleet was designed to kill fast, high-flying bombers. They had nothing in their inventory that could dogfight a Harrier at low altitude. The Yak-38, their attempt at a VTOL jet, was useless in comparison. It couldn't VIF. It had separate lift engines that were dead weight in a fight. The Harrier was a unified system. The mystery of the stopping plane was solved, but the solution was more terrifying than the mystery. The British had proven that the era of faster is better was over. The era of super maneuverability had begun. This realization led directly to the next generation of warfare. Look at the F-22 Raptor today. Look at the Russian Su-57 aircraft. What is their defining feature? Thrust vectoring. They use moving nozzles to turn tighter than aerodynamics should allow. They are the spiritual children of the Sea Harrier. But in 1982, over the freezing waters of the South Atlantic, the Argentine pilots didn't care about the future of aviation. They only cared about the nightmare in front of them. One specific engagement encapsulates the horror. An Argentine Skyhawk pilot, having miraculously survived a VIFing maneuver by a Harrier, returned to base. He sat in the debriefing room staring at the wall. When asked to the date is April 27, 1972, the location is a damp, concrete Air Defense Command bunker dug into the earth near the Ma River, Thanh Hoa Province, North Vietnam. This is the nerve center for the defense of the Ham Rong Bridge, known to its defenders as Khao Ham Rong, the Dragon's Jaw. Colonel Nguyen Van Dinh, a veteran of the People's Army of Vietnam, sips lukewarm tea and watches the sweeping green lines on his Soviet-made P-35 radar console. The air is a suffocating blanket of tropical heat, thick with the smell of damp soil, ozone from the humming electronics, and the sharp, acrid tang of gun oil. For 7 years, this small patch of the world has been arguably the most heavily defended single point on planet Earth. On the plotting board, operators move wooden blocks representing the batteries of the 236th Air Defense Regiment. They are masters of their craft. Outside, hidden in the humid jungle and limestone hills, is a near-impenetrable fortress of mathematics and steel. It is a dense, layered curtain of firepower. Scores of 37mm and 57mm anti-aircraft guns for the low-level threats. Batteries of massive radar-guided 100mm KS-19 cannons to tear apart the high-altitude formations. And at the heart of it all, 2 full battalions of the dreaded S-75 Divina surface-to-air missile system, the SA-2 Guideline, the same weapon that had swatted Francis Gary Powers' U-2 from the sky. Their doctrine is absolute, forged in the crucible of 7 years of relentless American bombing. It is a doctrine of attrition. The Americans will come in their waves of silver F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunderchiefs. They will come with hundreds of bombs. The Dragon's jaw will be obscured by a sky black with flak and crisscrossed with the smoke trails of missiles. A few planes will fall. The rest will drop their payload, which will harmlessly crater the rice paddies and surrounding hills. The Dragon's jaw, a colossal steel truss bridge built by the Chinese, will stand. It always stands. This bridge is more than a logistical artery for men and materiel flowing south. It is a symbol of Vietnamese defiance, a monument to American impotence. Operation Rolling Thunder, the 3-year-long American air campaign from 1965 to 1968, had been shattered against this very fortress. The Americans had flown 873 sorties against the Dragon's jaw. They had lost 11 aircraft, their crews killed or captured. They had dropped thousands of tons of explosives. They had failed to drop the bridge. Colonel Dinh and his Soviet advisors, who watch from the back of the bunker, are confident. They are professionals. They have proven their system works. They are the sentinels of the Red River, and their fortress is inviolable. On this hot April morning, the radar screens light up. Contacts, Sector 4. Multiple flights. Bearing 080. Altitude, 20,000 feet. Dinh nods. The daily ritual begins. Target acquisition radars engage. All batteries fire at will. The bunker shudders as the 100mm guns open up, a deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that the men feel in their chests. The high-pitched shriek of the SA-2 missiles launching tears the air. On the consoles, the American formations, call sign Oyster Flight, appear to behave strangely. They are not diving, they are not flying in a massive, orderly iron hand formation. A small flight of just 8 F-4 Phantoms makes a lazy, high-angle pass far out of range of the smaller guns. A junior lieutenant, his voice tight with confusion, reports from a forward observation post. "Comrade Colonel, they have released their bombs, but they are high. They will miss." Dinh watches the radar. The planes are already turning away. A pointless, wasteful gesture. He is about to log the sortie as another failure when the observer's voice crackles over the radio again, this time rising to a scream. "The bombs, Comrade Colonel, the bombs are. They are steering, they are flying, they are aiming for the bridge." Before Dinh can process the words, the earth heaves. A series of catastrophic concussive blasts, far larger than a standard 500-pound bomb, shakes the bunker so violently that men are thrown from their chairs. The power cuts out, replaced by the red emergency glow of battery-powered bulbs. A stunned, deafening silence falls, broken only by the ringing in their ears. The plotting board is a mess of toppled wooden blocks. Dinh, his heart pounding, grabs the field telephone to the observation post. The line is dead. Moments later, a runner bursts in, his face pale and streaked with dust. He doesn't salute. He simply stares at the colonel, his mouth agape. "Sir, it's gone. The western span. It's in the river. The bridge is broken." The men in the bunker, the victors of 1,000 aerial battles, look at each other in the ghostly red light, their faces etched with a profound, earth-shattering disbelief. The fortress had fallen. The impossible had happened. This was the kind of story we uncover every week here at Cold War Impact. Subscribe now so you don't miss the truth behind the secrets. To understand the depth of the shock that rippled through that Vietnamese bunker, one must first understand the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare in the 1960s. Hitting a target as small as a bridge from a fast-moving jet at 20,000 feet was not a matter of skill, it was a matter of pure, dumb luck. The guiding principle was circular error probable, or CEP. This was the radius of a circle in which 50% of all bombs dropped would fall. For a typical dumb iron bomb, the CEP was over 400 feet. The Dragon's jaw was only 56 feet wide. This meant that for every 2 bombs dropped, one would land somewhere within an area the size of a football stadium, and the other would land somewhere else entirely. The American solution, therefore, was mass. To guarantee a single hit, you had to drop hundreds of bombs, blanketing the entire area. This required hundreds of planes, flying wingtip to wingtip, braving the curtain of steel day after day. The Vietnamese and their Soviet patrons understood this math. They had built their entire air defense doctrine around it. They didn't need to shoot down every plane. They just needed to make the price of entry so high that the Americans would eventually bleed themselves dry. And it had worked. Operation Rolling Thunder was a strategic catastrophe for the United States. It was a war of gradualism, of political micromanagement, that cost America nearly 1,000 aircraft and the lives or freedom of hundreds of pilots, all for negligible results. The North Vietnamese air defense system, supplied and trained by the Soviet Union, had won. They had proven that a determined, well-equipped defender could defeat the air power of a superpower. This victory bred a deep-seated, entirely justified confidence. The Soviet SA-2 missile was the king of the sky. The radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery was lethal. Their doctrine was sound. Then, in March of 1972, the North Vietnamese army launched the Easter Offensive, a massive, conventional invasion of the South. The peace talks were over. The previous American administration's bombing halt was now null and void. President Richard Nixon gave the order to resume bombing the North, this time with a new purpose. This was not gradualism, this was destruction. The operation was codenamed Linebacker, and the Americans were about to introduce a new variable into the equation, one that would make the old math obsolete. On the other side of the world, in the quiet, air-conditioned laboratories of Texas Instruments in Dallas, Texas, a different kind of war had been waged. It was a war against the laws of physics and the tyranny of statistics. The problem was simple. The CEP of a dumb bomb was too large. The solution was revolutionary. What if the bomb wasn't dumb? An engineer named Weldon Wordsley, working on a Skunk Works project for the US Air Force, had developed a beautifully simple idea. It wasn't a new billion-dollar missile. It was a kit. A cheap bolt-on guidance package for a standard Mark 84 2,000-pound bomb. The kit, codenamed Paveway, consisted of 4 key parts: a small simple laser seeker on the nose, a set of steerable fins, or canards, a computer control system, and a small battery. The concept was semi-active laser homing. It operated like a moth to a flame. A second aircraft, or the bomb-dropping aircraft itself, would carry a targeting pod. The earliest and most crucial of these was the AN divided by AVQ-10 pave knife, a primitive, manually operated pod that looked like a small torpedo. Inside the cockpit, a weapons systems officer, the WSO, or guy in back, would stare into a tiny, green-lit eyepiece. He would find the target and use a joystick to place a crosshair over it, painting it with an invisible coded laser beam. The Paveway bomb, dropped from high altitude, would see this laser spot reflecting off the target. The seeker on its nose would lock on, and the fins would begin to steer the 2,000-pound bomb, making constant tiny corrections, guiding it with pinpoint precision directly onto the laser spot. The CEP of a dumb bomb was 400 feet. The CEP of a Paveway laser-guided bomb was, in theory, less than 10 feet. This was not just an improvement, it was a quantum leap. It was a weapon that changed the fundamental rules of air power. The fortress of flak and missiles built by the Soviets was designed to stop a battering ram, a massive, blunt force assault. The Americans had just invented a scalpel. They were about to conduct surgery, and the Dragon's jaw was first on the table. The scene in Colonel Din's bunker on April 27th was one of stunned confusion. The smoke cleared to reveal a crippling, but not fatal blow. One of the 2,000-pound guided bombs had punched through the steel decking of the western span, gouging a massive hole. Another had struck the concrete pier, shattering its structural integrity. The Dragon's jaw, while still standing, was broken. The artery was cut. The Soviet advisors were the first to react, their initial disbelief hardening into a cold, analytical fury. They demanded after-action reports, gun camera footage from the flak batteries, and fragments of the bomb casings. Their conclusion was a mixture of professional offense and grudging disbelief. The Americans had used some form of laser or television guidance. It was a technical trick, a gimmick. It had been a lucky shot, aided by a clear day and a lapse in jamming protocols. The Vietnamese, with a grim determination, set about their work. The fortress had been breached, but it would be rebuilt. Stronger. Thousands of workers swarmed the structure, and within weeks, a temporary pontoon bridge was operating, and repairs on the main bridge were underway. The Soviet advisors, meanwhile, doubled down on their proven doctrine. More guns were brought in, The number of anti-aircraft batteries ringing the bridge was increased from 40 to over 60. The radar crews were ordered to work in shorter, more frantic shifts, their eyes scanning for the telltale sign of the high-altitude phantoms. Their new directive was simple. Fill the sky with so much steel that no laser trick could possibly work. The sky would be opaque with flak. They were rebuilding a wall designed to stop a battering ram, convinced the enemy's scalpel had been a one-time experiment. They would not have to wait long. The date was May 13th, 1972. It was the third day of the newly authorized Operation Linebacker. This was not the hesitant, gradual, rolling thunder campaign. This was a declaration of total war on the North's infrastructure, and the Dragon's Jaw was target number one. This time, the Americans were not sending a small test flight. They were sending a storm. 16 F-4 Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, the Wolfpack, rolled in from the Gulf of Tonkin. 8 of them, the Iron Hand flight, were loaded with anti-radiation missiles to kill the SA-2 radars. The other 8, the strike package, carried a mix of 2,000-pound paveways and 500-pound dumb bombs. They were supported by F-4 seconds flying combat air patrol to hold off enemy MiGs and EB-66 destroyers to jam the enemy's radar frequencies. This was a symphony of overwhelming, coordinated power. In the bunker near the Ma River, the consoles exploded in a blizzard of green light. "Massive formation, Comrade Colonel! Sector 4! Multiple waves!" Colonel Din, his face a grim mask, gave the only order he could. "Fire! Fire everything!" The world outside the bunker erupted. It was a scene of apocalyptic fury. Every one of the 60 anti-aircraft batteries opened up at once. The 37mm and 57mm guns created a dense, pulsing wall of flak at the lower altitudes, a thundering, percussive storm of explosions. The heavy 100mm cannons joined in, firing radar-guided shells into the heavens, each one creating a black puff of greasy smoke and lethal shrapnel at 20,000 feet. Then came the missiles. The S-75 batteries, their crews frantic to avenge their earlier failure, began launching. In the span of 5 minutes, they fired 51 SA-2 missiles. The sky was filled with the spiraling white smoke trails of the flying telephone poles as they rocketed upwards, chasing phantom radar returns through the electronic chaos of the American jamming. It was the single most concentrated barrage of surface-to-air missiles ever fired in the history of aerial warfare. It was a fortress emptying its entire magazine in one desperate, defiant roar. From the ground, it looked as if the sky itself was being torn apart. The noise was a physical weight, a continuous, deafening explosion that shook the teeth. The defenders, their ears bleeding, screamed encouragement as they fed shells into the breeches of their guns. They were fighting with a suicidal bravery, convinced that no aircraft on Earth could survive this. Miles away, high above the inferno, Captain Mike Bush, a weapons systems officer in an F-4 call sign Stray Goose 03, calmly peered into the tiny, 3-inch green-lit eyepiece of his pave knife targeting pod. He was in the pickle barrel, the target acquisition area. Below him was not a sky, but a boiling black and red carpet of explosions. The shockwaves from the 100mm shells and the SA-2 seconds buffeted his Phantom, slamming it around the sky. His pilot, Major Lodge, held the aircraft steady, a heroic act of sheer willpower. "I've got it," Bush said, his voice clipped and professional over the intercom. His gloved hand was on the joystick, his eye pressed to the scope. He ignored the flashing missile warning lights. He ignored the feeling of the plane shuddering around him. He saw the bridge, a tiny dark line in his green-hued sight. He placed the crosshairs directly on the western pier, the one the Vietnamese were frantically trying to repair. "Laser on," he called. A fraction of a second later, Major Lodge released their two 2,000-pound paveway bombs. The bombs fell away, and the plane, suddenly lighter, jumped. "Off! We're off!" Lodge grunted, banking the F-4 hard, pulling Gs to escape the umbrella of death. But Bush's job wasn't over. He had to keep the laser on the target. He twisted in his seat, keeping his eye glued to the pod's sight as the plane raced away. "Okay, lasers on, tracking, 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, shack." The word shack, short for shacking up the target, an old bombing range term, was an understatement. Through his scope, Bush watched as two 2,000-pound bombs, flying with impossible intelligence, slammed directly into the western pier. The entire structure vaporized in a flash of white light. Simultaneously, other phantoms in his flight were doing the same. Stray Goose 01 painted the eastern pier. Oyster 04 painted the central span. In the space of 30 seconds, 12 laser-guided bombs, each one steered by a calm American WSO miles away, found their mark. In Colonel Din's bunker, the world ended. The observers on the field telephones were screaming, not in defiance, but in raw animal terror. The reports were nonsensical. "It's gone, it's all gone, the bridge is in the water, they destroyed it all." When the smoke finally cleared, the Dragon's Jaw was annihilated. It was not damaged, it was not breached, it was gone. The entire 540-foot-long steel truss superstructure, a monument of communist pride, had been torn from its foundations and lay in a twisted, burning heap in the Maar River. The guns fell silent. The missile crews stood, dumbfounded by their hot-smoking launchers. In the command bunker, the Soviet advisors were ashen-faced. Their entire, massive, expensive, and battle-proven air defense network, the pride of the Soviet military-industrial complex, had just been rendered utterly and completely useless. They had fired 51 missiles. They had filled the sky with tens of thousands of shells from over 60 gun batteries, and they had not touched a single American plane. The Americans, by contrast, had sent 8 strike aircraft. They had dropped 12 guided bombs. And they had achieved, in less than 5 minutes, what the entire US Air Force and Navy had failed to do in 3 years of bloody attritional warfare. This was not a battle, it was an execution. It was a cold, technological message, delivered with the precision of a scalpel, that stated one undeniable fact. The American fortress was the ground, defended by an army. The Soviet fortress was the sky, defended by a complex integrated system. And the Americans had just proven they could go anywhere they wanted, anytime they wanted, and destroy anything they wanted. The feeling in Din's bunker was not just failure, it was a deep, chilling, and profound humiliation. It was the realization that the very nature of war had changed, and they had been left, buried in their concrete bunker, hopelessly behind. The catastrophic loss of the Dragon's Jaw on May 13th sent a shockwave that traveled from the shattered command bunker in Than Hoa to the military high command in Hanoi, and finally, all the way to the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. The initial reports were treated as panicked exaggerations, but as the intelligence and the stark, undeniable reconnaissance photos piled up, a horrifying new reality set in. The Dragon's Jaw was not an anomaly, it was a prologue. The stunned disbelief of Colonel Din and his Soviet advisors was about to become the new, humiliating norm for every air defense commander in North Vietnam. The 873 sortie, multi-year failure of Operation Rolling Thunder had created a dangerous sense of Soviet doctrinal superiority. Operation Linebacker, which had just begun, was about to systematically, and in a matter of weeks, dismantle that superiority, piece by painful piece. What the Soviet planners failed to grasp was that Paveway wasn't just a new bomb, it was a new doctrine. The old American tactic was the sledgehammer, massive, 100-plane Alpha Strike formations that blotted out the sun and carpeted a square mile with iron, hoping to hit a single bridge. The new tactic was the scalpel. A single flight of 4 or 8 F-4 Phantoms could now be sent to do the work that had once required an entire carrier air wing. This new, terrifying efficiency meant the Americans were no longer constrained by attrition. They could now strike multiple, high-value, previously untouchable targets in a single day. The entire industrial and logistical web of North Vietnam was now on the executioner's block, and the executioner was moving fast. The next target on the list was the Paul Duma Bridge in Hanoi. If the Dragon's Jaw was a symbol of defiance, the Duma Bridge was the beating heart of the North's war machine. This massive, 1.7-kilometer-long cantilever bridge, built by the French at the turn of the century, carried the critical rail line and road that linked Hanoi to the main port of Haiphong and the Chinese border. 90% of all war material entering North Vietnam flowed over this single structure. It was therefore even more heavily defended than the Dragon's Jaw. It was protected by the inner ring of Hanoi's air defenses, a dense constellation of over 300 anti-aircraft guns and more than 20 SA-2 missile battalions. Soviet doctrine had ringed the city in layers of steel. To the Vietnamese High Command, the Duma Bridge was invincible. On May 10, 1972, just 3 days before the final destruction of the Dragon's Jaw, the US Air Force had sent a flight of F-4 seconds armed with paveways as part of a massive, multi-target raid. While MiG-21 seconds and F-4 seconds tangled in furious dogfights miles above, the strike package slipped through. In the command bunkers around Hanoi, the scene from Than Hoa repeated itself, but on a grander scale. The radars were a mess of jamming. The skies were filled with the smoke trails of missiles chasing Phantoms. And high above it all, the weapons systems officers in the Phantoms peered into their green scopes, placed their crosshairs on the bridge's load-bearing piers, and held them steady. The first 2,000-pound paveways, speaking to the invisible laser spots, flew with perfect, terrifying accuracy. They struck the piers, shattering the concrete and steel. The bridge did not just fall. It was surgically dismembered. A critical span collapsed into the Red River, cutting the capital's main artery. The heart had been struck. This single raid achieved what Rolling Thunder had failed to do in years of trying. The psychological impact on the residents of Hanoi, who had been told their capital was an impenetrable fortress, was devastating. They were witnessing their most sacred symbols of power being erased from the sky. But the campaign was only beginning. The paveway-equipped Phantoms became a relentless, unblinking eye, methodically moving from one critical target to the next. The Than Hoa thermal power plant, the largest in the country, sat right next to the Dragon's Jaw and had survived 7 years of near-constant, inaccurate bombing. On May 23rd, a flight of paveways struck it. But they didn't just crater the compound. The WSOs painted the individual turbines. They painted the boilers. They painted the command and control building. They disassembled the facility from 20,000 feet. The Yen Bien rail yards, the Hai Duong rail yards, vital marshalling yards, and dozens of smaller, previously low-value bridges were all struck and destroyed, one by one. The entire logistical network of North Vietnam was being systematically choked off, not by a massive blunt force campaign, but by a series of precise, daily, and unstoppable surgical strikes. For the Soviet and Vietnamese air defense crews, the battle became a waking nightmare. The recurring, haunting symbol of this new American dominance was not a sound like the SR-71's boom. It was an absence. The old war, the one they knew how to win, involved massive, visible formations of Phone 105 seconds and A4 seconds. They would come in low and fast, and you could see them, you could shoot at them. It was a fair fight. This new war was different. It was cowardly. It was unfair. The new symbol of American power was the tiny, green, glowing crosshair in a WSO's eyepiece. Miles away, high in the stratosphere, in a cockpit buffeted by distant, harmless explosions, a single American was calmly looking at his target as if it were a video game. He was detached from the chaos, an untouchable god with a green-lit eye, passing judgment. And the weapon itself was a ghost. It was an invisible, unjammable beam of light. Soviet air defense doctrine was built entirely on detection, detecting aircraft with radar, detecting heat with infrared, detecting radio transmissions with signals intelligence. But how do you detect a simple beam of light? How do you jam it? How do you defend against a weapon whose guidance system is nothing but a reflection? The Vietnamese gunners and missile crews were left with a crushing sense of futility. They would fire their entire stock of missiles at a sky full of electronic jamming, only to watch, in helpless fury, as the bridge or power station behind them vaporized. They were no longer defenders, they were witnesses. This new reality, the paveway and the pave-knife pod, became a relentless psychological weapon. It proved, on a daily basis, that the entire multi-billion ruble Soviet air defense system was worthless. It didn't matter how many guns you had. It didn't matter how many missiles you fired. It didn't matter how brave your soldiers were. The Americans were playing a different game, one where they could point from an untouchable perch in the heavens and delete reality. The profound sense of humiliation that began in the Dragon's Jaw bunker was now a chronic, nationwide condition. The Vietnamese were being shown, in the most brutal way possible, that their Soviet-built fortress was a comforting illusion, and that the Americans could, and would, take their country apart, one pinpoint laser spot at a time. The reports that landed on the desks of the Soviet Politburo and the High Command of the Vojska PVO, Air Defense Forces, in Moscow were not just troubling, they were an indictment. The grainy black and white reconnaissance photos from Hanoi and Than Hoa were undeniable. Bridges that had been mocked-up targets in Soviet war games, bridges that senior generals had personally guaranteed were impregnable, were now lying in twisted ruins at the bottom of rivers. The pride of the Soviet military-industrial complex was not just its nuclear arsenal, but its integrated air defense system. It was a doctrine and a product they exported across the globe as a shield against Western air power. From the deserts of Egypt to the jungles of Vietnam, the S-75 Davina missile was the great equalizer. Now, in a matter of weeks, a simple, cheap American kit bolted to a standard iron bomb had rendered their entire multi-billion ruble investment and the core of their export doctrine obsolete. This was a strategic nightmare. It wasn't a superweapon like the SR-71, a mythical billion-dollar phantom they couldn't catch. This was worse. This was an admission that their entire philosophy of air defense, massed guns, radar-guided missiles, dense, layered defense was wrong. The Americans were no longer playing the game of attrition, a game the Soviets and their proxies knew how to win. The Americans were now playing a game of precision, and the Soviets had no counter. An emergency mobilization of Soviet engineering and tactical minds was convened. The order from the Kremlin was unequivocal and laced with a deep professional anger. Find a way to defeat this laser trick. The first, most desperate countermeasure was tactical. If the bombs were guided by a laser, the solution was to blind the laser. The order went out to all high-value targets. Deploy smoke generators. Massive, truck-mounted smoke pots, burning oil and chemicals, were positioned upwind of every remaining bridge, power plant and rail yard. The idea was to create a thick, opaque curtain of smoke that would scatter the laser beam, preventing the WSO from painting the target and the bomb from seeing the spot. On paper, it was a logical, low-tech solution. In reality, it was a colossal failure. The American pilots and WSOs were not baffled by the smoke, they simply adapted. The winds in Vietnam were fickle. A sudden gust would create a momentary hole in the smoke screen, giving the WSO just enough time to lock the laser on. Shack! In other cases, the smoke would completely obscure the bridge deck, but the massive concrete piers were still visible underneath the smoke. The WSOs simply painted the piers shack. In the most cynical displays of technological contempt, the American pilots would simply orbit at 20,000 feet, far above the flak, and wait. They would wait for the smoke pots to run out of fuel, or for the wind to change. They had all the time in the world. The smoke, a symbol of the desperate, brutish Soviet counter, was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The second countermeasure was more aggressive. Send up the MiGs. Soviet advisors theorized that the F-4 Phantom carrying the pave knife targeting pod was the weak link. It had to fly relatively straight and level for the WSO to maintain his lock. The new doctrine called for elite Vietnamese pilots in their nimble, deadly Mi-G 21 seconds to ignore the bomb-dropping Phantoms and hunt for this lacing aircraft. They were to punch through the massive American fighter screens and kill the pointer at all costs. This, too, was a suicidal, flawed strategy. The American strike packages were not isolated flights, they were total war formations. They were screened by MiG-cap, combat air patrol flights of F-4 seconds armed only with air-to-air missiles. They were protected by Iron Hand flights, designed to kill the SA-2 radars. For a MiG-21 to even get close to the strike package, it had to fly a gauntlet of AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, all while being electronically blinded by American jamming. While a few brave Vietnamese pilots broke through and forced a WSO to break his lock, the exchange rate was horrific. The paveway system remained, for all intents and purposes, untouched. The final and most telling countermeasure was the Soviet attempt to copy the technology itself. Frantic, the design bureaus were ordered to create their own smart bomb. The result was the KH-23 Grom, known to NATO as the AS-7 Kerry. And this weapon, more than anything else, was a perfect illustration of the systemic, ideological gap between the two superpowers. The American paveway was a marvel of decentralized autonomous technology. The WSO painted the target, but the bomb itself, its tiny computer, its seeker, its fins, did all the hard work. It was a smart weapon. The Soviet KH-23 was, by contrast, a dumb weapon that relied on an overworked human. It was a radio command-guided missile. The Soviet pilot would fire the missile and then have to manually fly it to the target, using a small joystick in his cockpit, all while simultaneously flying his own 1,000-mile-per-hour Sukhoi Su-17 and dodging enemy fire. It was an ergonomically impossible, mentally crushing task, and it almost never worked. The American system empowered the operator by taking the workload off him. The Soviet system crushed the operator by doubling it. It was a weapon born of a command economy mindset, a brutish, centralized solution that fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of the American innovation. The killer statistic that proved the totality of this failure came from the numbers of Operation Linebacker itself. In Linebacker 1, the 8-month campaign that destroyed North Vietnam's infrastructure, Paveway laser-guided bombs represented less than 5% of the total tonnage of munitions dropped. Yet that tiny fraction of smart weapons accounted for over 50% of all the critical strategic targets destroyed: the bridges, the power plants, the command bunkers. The psychological toll of this systemic failure was catastrophic. The Soviet advisors in Hanoi, who had arrived as conquering heroes in 1965, were now seen as the architects of a colossal, expensive failure. The Vietnamese pilots and anti-aircraft crews, who had fought with unimaginable bravery and had beaten the Americans in Rolling Thunder, now felt a deep, corrosive cynicism. Their allies' vaunted technology, the shield of the socialist world, had been exposed as a paper tiger. The men in the bunkers around Hanoi and Haiphong were left to watch, in impotent rage, as small flights of American jets appeared in the stratosphere, untouched by their missiles, and calmly, methodically, and with perfect precision, erased their world from below. The confidence of 1968 was gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing despair. They were learning, in the most brutal way possible, that bravery and mass were no longer a match for an enemy that could point from the heavens and kill with a beam of light. The story of the Paveway bomb is not merely the story of a clever piece of technology. It is a microcosm of the entire Cold War, a perfect and undeniable illustration of the fundamental systemic differences that separated the two superpowers. The sleek, intelligently guided bomb that haunted the skies of North Vietnam was the physical embodiment of a system that fostered innovation, rewarded decentralized problem-solving, and possessed an industrial base so dynamic it could pivot and invent the future on demand. The Paveway was not the product of a monolithic 10-year plan decreed by a central committee. It was the result of a culture of competitive excellence. It was born in the private sector, at Texas Instruments, from a small team of engineers given the resources and the freedom to solve a complex problem in the simplest way possible. The result was not a brute force weapon. It was an elegant, efficient weapon. It was a cheap kit that made old, dumb bombs smart, leveraging existing assets rather than demanding a whole new, expensive ecosystem. It was a testament to American industrial flexibility, a symphony of off-the-shelf electronics, simple aerodynamics, and a revolutionary idea that the weapon, not the pilot, should do the final, difficult work. The Soviet Union, in contrast, produced the Kh-23 Grom. It was a machine born of fear and frantic imitation, a reactionary weapon built with a top-down, centralized logic. It represented the core of the Soviet system, a reliance on heavy-handed engineering and a desperate, almost slavish attempt to counter Western technology without truly understanding the innovative culture that produced it. They could build a radio-controlled missile, but they couldn't conceive of a cheap, autonomous kit. Their solution put more stress on the pilot, the human component, reflecting a system that saw the individual as a cog in the state's machine. The American system empowered the individual, the WSO, with a tool that made him a master of the battlefield. The failure of the Soviet-supplied air defense network in 1972 was not just a tactical failure, it was a profound systemic one. It was the sound of a rigid, command economy grinding against the relentless forward momentum of free market innovation. The Paveway proved that the true measure of a superpower wasn't just the number of guns it could field or the megatonnage of its missiles, but its ability to conceptualize and execute on a vision so advanced that the adversary is left not just defeated, but utterly mystified. The Fortress of Flak, a monument to the Soviet doctrine of mass, had been surgically dismantled by the American doctrine of precision. The ultimate demonstration of this victory was not another smoking bridge, but a quiet political act in a grand Parisian hall. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were the direct, undeniable result of the technological humiliation that began at the Dragon's Jaw. For years, the North Vietnamese, backed by their Soviet patrons, had operated on a simple, proven calculation. The American homeland was immune, But American political will was not. They believed they could absorb the clumsy, inaccurate, and attritional bombing of Rolling Thunder forever. They could trade jungles and rice paddies for American planes and pilots, a trade that would eventually bleed the American public's will to fight. They were winning the war of attrition. Operation Linebacker, powered by the Paveway, shattered that calculation. The new math was terrifying. The Americans were no longer losing planes. They were no longer carpet-bombing empty jungle. They were, with 0 to no losses, systematically, and with impunity, destroying the entire industrial and logistical foundation of the North Vietnamese state. Every bridge, every power plant, every rail yard, every factory was being erased, one by an invisible hand. The North Vietnamese High Command, watching their nation's ability to wage war evaporate, were forced to the negotiating table. The Soviets, watching their multi-billion ruble air defense network be exposed as a fraudulent paper-thin shield, had no new technological answers to offer. Their bluff had been called. The impenetrable fortress was a lie, and the Paveway had proven it. The precision strikes of Linebacker 1 and the brutal, concentrated follow-up of Linebacker 2 were a message, delivered with the cold logic of a laser, that the war was no longer sustainable for Hanoi. They had no choice but to sign. In the final epilogue of this technological struggle, the contrast could not be starker. The Soviet Union had built its military doctrine on a rigid materialist ideology that sheer mass, industrial might, and the courage of the socialist man could overwhelm any capitalist gimmick. They built a fortress of steel, concrete, and radar to protect this vision. But the American reality they encountered was not something their doctrine could explain. It was a reality that seemed to border on magic. A single, invisible beam of light that could bypass a billion-ruble fortress. A 2,000-pound bomb that could fly with the intelligence of a guided missile, yet was cheap enough to be used by the dozen. To the men in the PVO bunkers, the Paveway was not just a bomb. It was a chilling omen. It was a ghost from a future they could not reach. A future where intellect, not mass, was the ultimate arbiter of power. It demonstrated that the true engine of history was not found in a rigid, top-down 5-year plan, but in the boundless, creative and competitive potential of human freedom. The Soviet Empire, for all its might, was ultimately a brittle and hollow thing. It could project an image of immense power, but it could not withstand the quiet, persistent and undeniable truth delivered from the eyepiece of a pave-knife pod. The future belonged to precision, the future belonged to smart, and the Soviet system, rooted in the brute force of the past, was beginning to understand, in the smoking ruins of the Dragon's Jaw, that it had already lost.